After a grueling and bloody siege, the French army left Syria. At the walls of Acre, Bonaparte's soldiers demonstrated the utmost bravery. However, they now had to demonstrate the limits of their endurance as the scorching June sun-drenched desert lay ahead of them. The troops marched on foot, as all the horses and camels, without exception, were given to transport the wounded. The commander-in-chief, all the staff's officers, and all the generals also marched on foot, sharing the hardships equally with the soldiers. On May 21st, the army headed towards Egypt. Soldiers, weakened by disease and fatigue, were forced to carry their wounded brothers in turn. The heat was already very intense and gradually increasing. We followed the seashore and passed through Caesarea. I was very interested to learn about this ancient city. Our time in Jaffa was less pleasant. The city was half ruined and practically abandoned. All our sick and wounded filled the hospitals, ports, and streets. I witnessed the most heart-wrenching scenes. When Bonaparte arrived in Jaffa, he was informed that there were 25 patients heavily stricken with plague in the hospital, and they could not be evacuated. The medical commission confirmed that the patients were in a terminal state and were not transportable. In this situation, Bonaparte faced the dreadful necessity of deciding the fate of those who could not continue and for whom evacuating was impossible. After consulting with the doctors, the commander-in-chief proposed to ease the suffering of the hopelessly ill and give them opium so that the unfortunate could pass away without suffering and avoid the risk of being tortured by the Turks. The doctors' opinions were divided. The chief army officer, Desjeunet, refused, stating that his duty was to give the sick only what could cure them. Other doctors admitted this grim and inevitable necessity. I am aware that there are many distorted accounts of this matter. As for me, I am stating what I believed to be true then and what I believe to be true now. I cannot say that I saw anyone administering opium with my own eyes to the plague-stricken. I would be lying. However, I know that such a decision was made, that the order was given, and that the plague victims died. After leaving Jaffa, it took the French another 9 agonizing days to reach Egypt. When the exhausted soldiers saw Cairo, they felt the same satisfaction they would have felt upon seeing their homeland. On June 14th, Bonaparte entered Cairo. To dispel the rumors spread by enemies that the French had been defeated in Syria and also recognize the importance of propaganda, the French triumphantly organized their entry into the capital. Their path was strewn with palm leaves, captured enemy banners were carried at the front, and the orchestra played victory marches. Meanwhile, the enemy prepared for a new battle. The outcome of the siege of Acre had infatuated the British Commodore, Sir Sidney Smith. He believed that Bonaparte's army had suffered irreparable losses in Syria, and he actively persuaded the Turks to urgently send another army to Egypt to finish off the French. With an army of 25,000 men, you can cover yourself with immortal glory, for the French army is self-destroyed, very dissatisfied, demoralized, and ready to revolt. It has suffered huge losses from the fire of British ships of the line and frigates. Its losses from the desert crossing in the June heat were no less significant. Bonaparte was aware of the impending landing. It was expected that the Turks would attempt to land an army in Damietta or Abukir. In addition, there were substantial reasons to believe that British troops would land along with the Turks. Therefore, upon returning to Cairo, Bonaparte immediately began preparing for a new battle. The regiments replenished their losses with a large number of men from the garrisons and those discharged from hospitals. The cavalry also set about replenishing its ranks. Part of the troops was transferred from Upper Egypt. Bonaparte took all possible measures to make up for the losses, and by early July, the French army had rested and the conditions of the troops had significantly improved. Egypt seems to us like another France, a second home. Our harsh memories are already fading. We have returned to our friends and comrades, and past sufferings are already forgotten. However, besides the enemy's planned landing, Bonaparte knew something else. Even during the siege of Acre, the commander-in-chief received information from various sources that a new coalition had formed against France, even more powerful than the first one. It was not difficult for Bonaparte to speculate about the situation in France. The corrupt and disrespected Directory was unable to unite the nation to fight the coalition. If the French troops on the main front failed, Egypt would no longer matter, and the army stationed here would be doomed. Nevertheless, despite the alarming news from France, Bonaparte continued to actively strengthen his position in Egypt. Fortification works were energetically carried out in the fortresses and on the coast. Navigation on the Nile was improved. In addition, the work of the Institute continued actively. Among other things, scientists studied the causes of the plague. They were also working on a project for the construction of the Suez Canal. On July 15th, Bonaparte, along with the scientists, visited the pyramids of Cheops, and on this very day at 2 p.m., he received the news that 80 transport ships, escorted by British ships of the line, had anchored in the Bay of Abukir. He was also informed that Turkish troops, commanded by Mustafa Pasha, had already captured the coastal fortifications, killing 300 defenders. Although this news reached Bonaparte when he was not in Cairo, it did not come as a surprise to him. 3 days later, he was already in Romania, 80 miles to the north, where he was concentrating his strike forces. The speed and precision of execution were incredible. The entire army was set in motion. It took Bonaparte only 9 days to gather the troops scattered throughout Egypt and to move them to Abukir. Mustafa Pasha primarily intended to establish a powerful fortified beachhead near Abukir and take a defensive position, in which the Turks had much greater advantages than in the offensive. At that moment, the Ottoman army numbered about 13,000 warriors. Having secured the coast, Mustafa Pasha was awaiting the arrival of another Janissary division and cavalry. Only after that did he plan to move further. Therefore, such a rapid concentration of French troops disrupted all the Turks' plans. Moreover, the position chosen by the Ottoman commander could be considered strong if he were to fight, for example, with the Mamluk army. However, the Turks faced the best army in Europe, and it was not in the terrible condition the British mistakenly believed. These were the same heroes of the battles of Castiglione, Arcole, and Rivoli. By July 24th, to Mustafa Pasha's great surprise, the French army was in the vicinity of Abukir. At dawn the next day, Bonaparte's army deployed in battle order. Murat's cavalry took the center, Destens' brigade was on the left, Lannes' division was on the right, and Linus was in reserve. 15 cannons were distributed along the front. At this moment, Bonaparte had about 8,000 men. Kleber's division was still on the march. They expected to arrive in the afternoon. The Ottoman troops had by this time managed to construct 2 defensive lines, which were covered by redoubts. A detachment of 5,000 men defended the first line. The second line of defense housed 7,000 men. Mustafa Pasha had 30 cannons. Gunboats were stationed in the open sea, supporting the flanks of this position. Sidney Smith, with a small number of British officers, was also on hand and served as the Pasha's deputy. Finally, the French artillery opened fire from all their cannons. The cannonade lasted 2 hours. Then Bonaparte, with the forces of 2 divisions, launched a massive attack on the first defensive line. Along with the infantry attack, the cavalry moved forward. The French acted decisively and in unison, which could not be said of the Ottoman troops. Destens and Lannes' infantry attacked the front redoubts, while Murat's squadrons penetrated through the gaps in the fortifications and flanked the enemy from behind. Mustafa Pasha did not dare to counterattack with reserves to support the troops in the first line. As a result, the Turks were caught between the cavalry and infantry, and after a brief fight, the defense was broken. Deprived of the possibility to retreat, they had no choice but to plunge into the sea. Having overcome the first line of defense, the French moved forward and attacked the central redoubt of the second line, but here they encountered more serious resistance. The entire tip of the peninsula turned into a field of slaughter, disorder, and confusion, which further disrupted the already weak discipline of the Ottoman troops. Nevertheless, the Turks held their ground bravely. Mustafa Pasha concentrated all his forces in the center to hold land, but he failed to notice that the left flank was left unprotected. To the Turks' misfortune, Murat noticed this, and within minutes, 900 cavalrymen in tight squadrons launched an attack.
Sabre à la main!
Murat's attack was so unexpected and vigorous that the Turks had no time to respond. In a matter of minutes, the French cavalry crushed the enemy's flank. Then Murat rushed straight to the tent of the Ottoman commander-in-chief. Mustafa Pasha did not lose his composure. He managed to fire a pistol shot directly at the French general's head. But Murat was lucky. The bullet entered one cheek and exited through the other without hitting any bone or damaging any teeth. In the next second, Murat struck with his saber, severing several fingers on Mustafa Pasha's hand, after which he captured him. From this moment, the battle descended into chaos. The remaining Turkish troops, gripped by terror, fled and plunged into the sea, attempting to swim to the ships, but only a few managed to do so. Sir Sidney Smith also narrowly evaded capture and barely made it to his boat. In Fort Abukir, around 2,500 Turks continued to resist. Bonaparte addressed the garrison, promising them safe passage to the Turkish ships in case of surrender. Initially, however, the Turks refused to capitulate. They held out for a week, despite the most incredible hardships. Yet, on August 2nd, driven mad by thirst, they finally emerged. They looked like ghosts. They came out of the fort, bowed, and asked for death. But our commanders and soldiers, forgetting their previous hatred for the enemy, felt compassion for them, caused by their terrible condition. We gave them water and food. The Turks ate so ravenously that 400 of them died from indigestion before they could be evacuated to Alexandria. Thus, the 13,000-strong Ottoman army ceased to exist. French losses did not exceed 1,000 killed and wounded. After the battle, Bonaparte sent 2 officers aboard the British flagship to arrange a prisoner exchange. The ever-polite Sir Sidney Smith handed the French 2 sets of European newspapers. In them, Bonaparte read the news up to June 10th, and his grim suspicions were confirmed. On all fronts, France was on the verge of catastrophe. The French had been driven out of Germany by Archduke Charles and out of Italy by Suvorov. The Cisalpine Republic had been dissolved. Mantua was under siege. The government was lurching from one political and economic crisis to another, with the likely prospect of the Republic's complete overthrow. The situation in France was so desperate that the Directory had even decided to bring Bonaparte back from Egypt. Thanks to Admiral Bruy successfully relocating the fleet from Brest to Toulon, the French temporarily gained an advantage in the Mediterranean. Moreover, the Allied Spanish fleet had also joined the French squadron in Toulon. In total, Bruy had 46 ships of the line and could confidently dominate the Mediterranean for 3 months. This was more than enough time to evacuate part of the forces from Egypt. You yourself, Citizen General, can judge whether you can safely leave part of your forces, and the Directory authorizes you, in that case, to entrust your command to whomever you deem necessary. Nevertheless, the Directory still lacked the courage to do this, and the chance to control the Mediterranean was lost. However, Bonaparte had not been counting on it. After receiving the latest news about the state of the Republic, he decided once again to trust his luck and leave Egypt on his own, despite the risk of being captured by the British. The preparations for this were carried out in the utmost secrecy. Only a few people knew about the commander-in-chief's plans, and within 2 weeks, 2 frigates were ready in the port of Alexandria. Before leaving Egypt, Bonaparte prepared detailed instructions for General Kleber, who was to take over as commander-in-chief, on further actions. Bonaparte's decision sparked mixed reactions throughout the army. Some considered it the only way out of the situation, while others expressed bewilderment and condemnation. The greatest outrage was voiced by Kleber, who was burdened with the responsibility of commander-in-chief. Soldiers, the news from Europe has compelled me to return to France. I am leaving General Kleber in command of the army. You will soon receive news from me. It pains me to leave the soldiers I love, but this absence will only be temporary. The commander I am leaving in charge has the confidence of the government and mine. On August 22nd at 9 p.m., 2 frigates set sail from the shores of Egypt. The commander-in-chief, the chief of staff, some scientists, and aides departed on the frigate named Muiron. This frigate was named in honor of the adjutant who was killed in the Battle of Arcole, covering the commander-in-chief with his own body. Generals Lannes, Murat, and Marmont sailed on another frigate. The route was laid along the African coast, and luck was once again on Bonaparte's side. The voyage was relatively smooth and lasted 47 days. In the first week of October, due to a severe storm, the French had to make a brief stop in Ajaccio. Finally, on October 8, 1799, after narrowly avoiding a confrontation with Lord Keith's British fleet, the frigates approached French shores. On October 8th, we were already in the harbor of Fréjus and preparing to land when word spread that General Bonaparte was on one of the frigates. In an instant, the sea was covered with rowboats. We vainly asked them to keep away. We were simply seized and brought ashore. And when we spoke to the crowd about the dangers they could face due to the lack of quarantine measures, they exclaimed, "Better the plague than the Austrians." I must say that this joyful excitement was beyond imagination unless witnessed. Everywhere along the road, from Aix to Lyon, in towns and villages, he was greeted with enthusiasm bordering on madness. This explosion of feelings and amazement, these hopes found everywhere, stirred the hearts of the French with the most cherished emotions and the noblest thoughts in their minds. It did not take a seer to predict that the days of the Directory were numbered.